Ladies and gentlemen. Eli peered out through the bars, though he couldn't touch them. A small crowd had gathered there on the dirt, staring, their faces slack, almost uninterested. Eli wondered what they were seeing, an emaciated wreck of a man, filthy black hair falling in tattery strips around a skeletal face. A fake, a charlatan. They seemed unmoved. Yes, sir, all the way from Transylvania. Freddy was on a roll, jabbing his cane at a badly painted backdrop depicting a caped monster, hunched before a crumbling European castle. Eli was trying to look menacing, but he couldn't help the sigh that escaped his lips. He'd been born in Illinois and turned in Arizona. He'd never been to Transylvania in his life, probably couldn't even find it on a map. He'd never even been outside of the continental United States. Cower in fear, mere mortals, for here is a creature who lives only by night, lives by feeding on human prey. Freddy punctuated these last two words with another poke from his cane. Eli listened to the rise and fall cadence of the circus owner's pitch. He could have hummed along with it, like a familiar song. How many nights had he heard it? He'd lost track. The night he'd emerged from his casket and seen the cage bars, carved with tiny crosses and festooned with garlic to prevent his escape, seemed a very long time ago. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the only living vampire in captivity, I give you... Freddy paused dramatically and swept his arm toward the cage. The king of the bloodsuckers, Lord Ruthven. Eli bared his yellow fangs on cue. As stupid as he'd always assumed Freddy to be, Eli had to admit that the guy knew his vampire literature. With a flourish, the circus owner produced a limp rat from the folds of his spangled coat. There was a stirring in the crowd. Some of the girls glanced at each other and crossed their arms, scratching nervously at their elbows. No one left, and no one spoke. Freddy flicked the rat into the cage with practiced ease. The eyes of the crowd, black pinpoints, followed its gray arc as though it was a ball in a tennis match. Eli scrabbled for it as soon as it touched the dirt at the bottom of his cage. It was degrading, and part of him grew disgusted at the likely sight of himself, but the growls from his concave stomach were a powerful motivator. He brought the tiny corpse to his mouth. The rat was dead, but it was still warm. Eli wasn't sure how Freddy killed them, but it didn't matter, he supposed. The crowd gasped in unison as Eli bit into the fur, gulping the few precious ounces of blood. It was sticky and bitter, but he lapped at it greedily. He even squeezed the rat in his weakened hands, trying to get the last drops. Nourishment gone, he threw the empty husk into the pile of straw in the corner. When he looked up through the bars again, he could see the expressions of revolted fascination on the faces of those assembled. He scowled out at them, remembering the days when he was stronger, when he could have taken down each and every one of those fidgeting humans with a blow, draining them of blood and leaving their pallid carcasses to rot in some obscure clump of shrubbery, to be found later by mystified authorities. His hunger reared up now, egged on by his pitiful meal, a pull from somewhere deep inside his body, a hunger on the razor edge of agony. Eli reached for the bars, forgetting himself for a moment in the heat of his wanting. His hands closed around the metal. A sharp hiss of burning flesh reached his ears before he felt anything, but moments later the pain came, his palms seeming to shriek of their own accord, the fire racing from them to ignite his entire body in excruciating conflagration. He snatched his hands away, leaving ragged bits of flesh behind, and then groaned like a wounded animal. The people outside still stared, open-mouthed like fish on dry land, but Eli turned his back on them. The show was over. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll come this way, she's a quarter ton of fun, more woman than you've ever laid your eyes upon. Freddy was moving on to the next attraction, and Eli retreated into the shadows, curling up in the straw amid the rat bones and matted fur. Forms moved across the front of his cage, a few faces taking one last glimpse at the broken man, the broken creature within. He snarled at the stragglers, flashing his laser-red eyes, but there was no heart in it. He was no threat to them, not in his present condition. He supposed they knew it, for they did not hurry away, but just turned their heads and kept walking, forgetting him already in the bright promise of a new spectacle. The evening wore on, and one by one the lights on the midway began to go dark. The shouts and laughter and music became muted, and then ceased completely, giving way to the burr of crickets and the hollow calls of owls. Eli closed his eyes and smelled the night closing in around him, sniffed at the essence of the dead rat upon his fingers, as if remembering the perfume of a departed loved one. He was cold and weak and famished. He rolled over on his back and stared at the ceiling of his cage, wishing he could see the vast starry sky arching over his open grave, just like it had before, when he'd been free, when the night had been his ally and not his jailer. As he was thus lamenting, Eli heard a shuffling in the dirt outside. A rebellious child, perhaps, who had stayed behind after the circus had closed, to get one last glimpse. Psst, Eli! No, not a child, but a woman. Are you all right in there? He'd heard the voice only a couple of times before, but after a moment he recognized it as Maisie's. He dragged himself up out of the straw. Maisie stood in the moonlight, the bars dividing her enormous girth into several pink and equal sections. The shadow that fell at her feet looked like an enormous black hole in the earth. Her lipstick was smeared, her forehead filmed with sweat. Eli knew she'd come from Little Lenny's trailer. He didn't mix with the other freaks or members of the circus crew, but you'd have to be blind and deaf not to know about the affair between the fat lady and the dwarf. Eli often tried to picture the two of them in Lenny's cramped quarters, their disparate bodies knotted and entwined in the act of love. The incongruity always made his head ache. Good evening, Maisie. You seemed a bit out of it tonight, honey. Her sausagey fingers curled around the bars, revealing perfectly manicured nails. The light from the waxing moon caught the gold strands threading through her bouncing ringlets of hair. I've just been tired, that's all. He approached her, his bare feet scratching in the dirt. He could clearly hear the throb of her heart, even from several yards away, and he could smell the blood pumping endlessly through that heart. You're hungry too, I'll bet, Maisie said, watching him with her dancing green eyes. Freddie should give you something besides dead rats to eat. Like what? It isn't as though he'd bring a human in here. It was a more candid statement than he'd intended, and he thought it might upset her. It didn't seem to. I wouldn't put it past him, the creep, she snorted. Then she pressed her face into the bars, smiling with her smudgy lips. You can come closer if you want. I won't bite you. She laughed, clear and bell-like in the night air. Eli risked 2 more steps toward her. He had seen Maisie around, of course, and knew her to wave to, but she'd never come to his cage after hours before, never talked to him like this. She seemed to have no fear of him, not like the others. That's a little better, she said, considering his emaciated form as if it were a particularly delectable dessert. I wanted to give you something. Eli shuffled a bit closer, suddenly very nervous. What is it you want to give me, Maisie? A stake through the heart, perhaps? A mouthful of wolfsbane? You have to come a little closer and then I'll show you. Eli was a prisoner, a shell of his former self, but his instincts were still acute. Show me first. Oh, you're no fun, Lord Ruthven, she said with a pout. Never taking her eyes from his, she pushed back her pink frilly sleeve and stuck her jiggling arm through a gap in the bars. I want you to have a drink. Eli stared down at the arm, the peach fuzz flesh stretched taut over layer upon layer of fat. She looked delicious, but this was Maisie, sweet 500-pound Maisie, who had always been friendly. The vampire shook his head. I couldn't do that. I'm not saying you can suck me dry, Drac, she said with a giggle. You can just have a sip. I know you want one. I saw the way you looked at it. She was right. He did want to very badly. But Maisie, He looked into her eyes, which were wide and intense, lit with an inner glow. I don't know if I'd be able to stop, he said. I wouldn't be able to control myself. Oh, you wouldn't hurt little Maisie, she purred, lashes fluttering. I trust you. Maisie, you hardly know me. I can't. Eli, listen. All flirtatiousness dissolved. Now she was all practicality. I've been watching you for months, living in that filthy cage, scrabbling around after Freddie's scraps. You're starving, honey. She blinked as if fighting back tears. I just can't stand to see anyone like this. Her arm was beginning to quiver from being held outstretched for so long. Eli hesitated just for a moment, but the quivering arm decided him. He couldn't resist her anymore. He scurried over and fell down on his knees, taking her flesh in his bony fingers, trying to be gentle but tugging at it anyway, so hard that he saw her wince. His teeth found her skin, salty with drying sweat, and he pressed his lips against her wrist, suppressing the urge to tear into it, though just barely. Calm, he thought. His whole wretched body was shuddering. The first drop of human blood in how long? Months, had she said? glided onto his tongue, and his eyes rolled back into his head at the ecstasy of it. He sucked and swallowed, feeling as though he could never get enough of it, as if he could rip the veins from their moorings and gulp straight from them, until his belly was stretched and distended with the feasting. Heaven it was, sheer heaven. Eli. He seemed to hear a voice very far away, but he couldn't heed it, wouldn't. The warmth of live blood slithering down his throat was blotting out all else. Eli! Suddenly his life-giving sustenance was wrenched away. His fingers grasped at nothing. His mouth gaped, wet and red. The sense of loss threatened to crush him. More, please. His voice was thick. Not tonight. Maisie was clutching her wrist to the frilly bodice of her dress. Her fleshy jowls were pulled into a frown. That was very naughty, Eli. He lowered his head. I'm sorry, but I told you how it would be. I know you did. She peered at her wound, then quickly covered it with her hand again. The silence of the night was unbroken, but Maisie looked left and right nonetheless, checking for witnesses. She backed away from the bars a few steps. Maybe I'll come back in a few nights, she said, retreating still farther. You can have more then, if you promise to be good. Maisie? He didn't want her to go. He could see the fear in her face, the fear he'd planted there. She wouldn't come back. Good night, Eli. She waddled off, her pink ballet slippers leaving surprisingly delicate prints in the dust. At one point, she turned and looked at him over her shoulder, and she winked, a secret little gesture that made Eli's spirits sing. Perhaps he hadn't frightened her away after all. When she had disappeared into her own trailer, Eli curled back up in the straw. He wanted to lie there for a while, lie there and feel her blood coursing through him, nourishing him, making him stronger. Dear Maisie. In a few hours, he would have to crawl into his coffin and close out the day, but after that, night again, and perhaps another visit. Perhaps she really would come back. If not tomorrow night, then the next. She would return. For the first time in months, Eli managed to smile. Maisie came again 2 nights later, after all the lights in the other trailers had winked out. The whole troop had traveled the night before, long rows of caravans across empty roads, but the place they had settled looked little different than the last. The fat lady smelled of sweat and sex as she approached. She'd been with the dwarf again. Eli surprised himself by feeling a twinge of rage at the thought of them together, opposite extremes of human large and small. The dwarf could only love the voluminous rolls of fat on Maisie's outside, after all. Eli could appreciate the entire woman, right down to her red blood cells, her beautiful miles of capillaries. She put her arm through the bars without a word. He was better able to control himself this time, since he wasn't quite so famished. He drank from her other wrist, so as not to worsen the bruise from his first attempt. She felt some discomfort, he could see it in the lines around her mouth, but she didn't complain. Eli kept eating the rats, kept baring his teeth for the ever-changing packs of dullards that gathered in every backwater town they stopped in. He even added a few extra growls to his repertoire, jumped at the bars to frighten the kiddies. He grew stronger each time Maisie visited, which ended up averaging about 3 times a week, always after her trysts with little Lenny. A month passed like a dream, and Eli began to look and feel as he had before his embarrassing capture. His body had filled out, his hair had thickened, and no longer looked quite so bedraggled. His flashing red eyes were as bright as a cat's. Maisie came again, 2 nights after another move. Thick bracelets encircled her wrists. If any of the others had noticed her wearing them, or wondered what they concealed, Eli hadn't heard of it. After he had drunk a little, the fat lady pulled away and considered him through the bars. "I've been thinking," she said. Eli wiped her blood from his lips. "Have you?" He tried to keep his tone neutral, but he was afraid of what she was going to say, afraid she was going to discontinue their rather rewarding relationship. He couldn't bear it if that was what she was going to say. "Maisie." She spoke as if she hadn't heard him. "You've been getting so much stronger, Eli. It's really amazing." "Please don't say it." "Why not?" She goggled at him. "All I was going to say was that you should really think about getting out of here. You're a powerful man." She breathed out through her lips. "Someone like you shouldn't be caged up like you are, forced to perform for idiots. It isn't right. So I was thinking that maybe I could help you escape somehow." The thought of freedom was a strange one for him, and one he realized he hadn't entertained for quite some time. He had become used to his situation, institutionalized perhaps, and completely dependent on Maisie. He knew that wasn't good, knew it couldn't last forever, yet he still felt a tug of disappointment all the same. "How will you help me?" "I'm not sure yet," she said, leaning close to the bars, stage whispering like a giant femme fatale in a film noir. "I thought I could steal the keys from Freddy, though I'm not sure where he keeps them. Could you get out if I open the cage?" Eli stepped back and considered the bars, hung with their withering talismans. Yes, he could probably get past if the door was opened, provided he didn't touch anything. For a second, he wished he could turn into a mist like they did in the movies, but then he dismissed the fancy. "I'm sure I could," he said. "Well then, I'm not sure when I'll be able to get the keys, but it'll be soon, I promise, and then I'll come and get you after everyone's asleep. I'll even give you a goodbye sip before I set you free." Eli was touched in a way he'd never been with a human. What were they anyway but cattle, meat for his kind? But his chest fluttered with impossible tenderness for Maisie, all 500 wonderful pounds of her. "Thank you," he said. It was all he could think of to say. There were no words, really, to express his gratitude, and even though he still felt a selfish twang of regret at losing his meal ticket, he knew he couldn't ask more of her. She'd done so much. She seemed to understand everything he'd been thinking. Her laughing eyes shined in the moonlight. "Soon, Eli," she said hoarsely. Then she pressed her fingers to her lips and blew a kiss through the cage bars. Eli watched her go, her thighs wobbling and rubbing together, her ankles swollen blue. "Could I take her with me when I go," he thought, "and turn her into a thing like me? I could be with her forever then, lose myself in her ample flesh and undying loyalty." He chuckled to himself. Her blood must be making him giddy. She didn't come the next night. Eli hadn't really been expecting her so soon, or so he told himself, but the depth of his despair at her absence alarmed him. He made himself relax. She'd said it wouldn't be right away, hadn't she? Perhaps it was harder getting the keys from Freddy than she'd anticipated. He had to give the girl a chance. The next night passed just as uneventfully, and Eli's spirit sank to a lower point than he would have thought possible. Was it the promise of freedom, or simply the thought of seeing Maisie that gave him hope, her failure to show the reason those hopes were so cruelly dashed? On the third night, he tried to catch her eye as she stood on the platform at the end of Freddy's outstretched cane. She preened like a grotesque funhouse mirror version of a beauty queen, clad in her absurd feminine frills, yards and yards of pink tulle and satin like a froth of cake frosting. He waved surreptitiously, flapping his bony fingers, trying not to draw the attention of the gaping crowd in front of her. She either didn't notice or was pointedly ignoring him. He considered calling to her, such was his desperation that he didn't care who heard, but then he thought better of it. Frustrated, he kicked the corpse of tonight's rat into the corner and sat down to wait. The midway closed down a little while afterwards, though to Eli it felt as though an eternity had passed. He sat very still in his cage as the night seeped into his pores. He didn't know what ramshackle town they were in tonight. He'd lost track of the stunted trees and the choking weeds, and the sloping foreheads of the circus patrons, all alike in every respect. But it didn't matter, really, what town they were in. The darkness smelled the same everywhere. He thought he must have dozed, because it seemed only seconds later that the air was alive with noise. His lids snapped open. At first he saw nothing but the scrubby foliage tossed about in the breeze, but then, one by one, lights flicked on in each of the trailers, yellow squares falling upon the dusty ground. The sounds, which soon revealed themselves to be screams, reached a critical pitch, two voices harmonized in a symphony of pain and terror. Then, abruptly, one voice ceased, leaving the other to continue alone, soaring to heights surpassing angels. Eli wasn't sure how he knew, but he had no doubt that the remaining scream was Maisie's. As to the other, the one that had been cut short, whose? Lenny's? Trudy the Torso's? He had no idea, and didn't think he cared in any case. Only Maisie's agony moved him. The vampire was on his feet and had crossed his cage to the bars in less than a moment. He couldn't touch the bars, Christ, but he longed to grab them, pull them apart with his growing strength, rip them from the cage and fling them hither and yon like massive yarrow sticks, their pattern in falling predicting his likely future. He thought he might risk it and grasped the bars in his hands, face contorted in concentration, but the metal burned and tore, sending electric currents coursing up and down his arms, threatening to fry him, to flay him with fire. He shrieked and pulled back, adding his feral cries to the spiraling opera of Maisie's distress. He called her name, then called for the others to come out of hiding, to come and help her. Why didn't they? Where was Freddy, or Atlas the Strongman? They could help her if they would only... His vision was suddenly overwhelmed by what seemed like acres of heaving white flesh and copious rolls, as Maisie, nude and screeching, burst from Freddy's trailer like a human wrecking ball, her breasts and legs and stomach smeared with blood. Eli called for her, straining his body as close to the bars as he dared. Her eyes were as big as shot puts, all pupil and no white, but he couldn't tell if she was seeing him in her panic. Maisie! She was running pell-mell toward his cage, running as fast as she could manage, which given her bulk was really no faster than a brisk walk. Eli couldn't understand why she was naked or why she was running or why she was covered in blood, and where was everyone for fuck's sake? And he opened his mouth to ask her these things, to bring some clarity to the chaos, but then his eyes flicked upward, seeing beyond her, and he knew. A woman, tall and wisp-like, thick red hair falling in natural waves around a flawless pale face, stepped down from the door of Freddy's trailer, moving languidly, gracefully, as if she had all the time in the world. Her eerie slowness contrasted sharply with Maisie's frenzied waddling, and the sight could have been funny if Eli had been sufficiently cold-hearted to appreciate the humor. The woman came closer, seeming to glide over the ground, her lips red and glinting wet in the moonlight. Eli! Maisie was mere feet from his cage, her pendulous breasts slapping, pudgy hands beseeching. She came for Freddy. I was trying to get the keys. She was babbling, hysterical, and Eli wasn't sure if he knew exactly what she meant. Who was the woman? She was one of his kind, of course. He could tell that by looking at her. But what was she doing here? What did she want with Freddy, or with Maisie? Eli knelt down to bring himself face to face with the fat lady. She was terrified, but somehow sublime in her terror. How her blood would taste now, spiked with the spice of adrenaline. He put the thought from his mind. I didn't get the keys, she was saying, barely able to talk through her panting breaths. She killed Freddy and I couldn't find them. The woman had closed the distance between herself and her quarry with superhuman speed, and Eli could now see the hard, cold lines of her beauty, the sharp, upturned angles of jaw and brow, so unlike Maisie's soft curves and round cheeks. She killed Freddy, the fat lady gasped again, clutching the bars in her hands. Eli reached out and brushed her finger with his, thinking of her beautiful wrists, bruised violet, mere inches from his questing mouth. No escape, no, not tonight, but her flesh was there before him. He could smell it, almost taste its arousing tang of fear. The vampire woman appeared behind Maisie, her flint-black eyes fixed on Eli. Take a look at you, she said, her voice like diamonds encased in velvet. How pathetic you are. Who are you? His hand still stroked Maisie's, and the contact seemed to have calmed her a bit. A friend, the imperious woman replied, contempt radiating off her shimmering skin. Our little community heard of your capture and subsequent degradation. We've been tracking you for weeks. Maisie was crying, softly, but she kept still. And why would you do that? Eli asked. Why is my situation any business of yours? She arched an eyebrow at him. The fate of any one of our kind is my business, she said. I thought you would be pleased to see that you had not been abandoned. Or am I to assume you enjoy being paraded before slack-jawed vermin like a performing dog? Eli squared his shoulders. I'm capable of looking after myself. So I see. Her bloody lips curled upward in an icy parody of a smile. But you put too much faith in these useless sacks of flesh, my brother. This one told you herself that she was unable to attain the means for your escape, did she not? The woman ran a long fingernail down Maisie's spine, and the fat lady shuddered and closed her eyes, tears spilling from between the lashes. Leave her be, Eli said, with less authority than he'd hoped. Or what? You'll leap through those bars and tear out my heart? You know I can't do that. Can't you? Well, then I suppose I can do as I please. The woman lowered her head and extended her long red tongue, drawing it along Maisie's bare shoulder with languorous ecstasy. Oh, she's delectable, the woman mewed. I know you've taken a few paltry samples, but don't you think it's time to feast? She's trembling under my hands, brother. The fear will make her taste of heaven. Eli breathed raggedly, torn between desires. The scent of Maisie's blood was a heady narcotic, making him stupid with hunger and longing. But her terror also inspired pity, something he had never felt toward a human, not ever in his long life. The cocktail of emotions made him feel faint and ill. "Shall I release you myself?" the woman asked. Her hands were vice-tight around Maisie's upper arms. "There's enough of her for us to share. Afterwards, you may come back to your own people, with me." Eli couldn't help himself. "How could you release me? The bars." She laughed, a coal-black sound. Eli noticed that all the crickets and nightbirds had fallen silent. "You're more of a rube than the imbeciles who come to gawk at you," she spat. "Garlic and crosses. How could such things possibly harm creatures such as we?" "My hands burn whenever I touch them." Eli held up his flayed palms as evidence. "Only because you believe they will," she said. Her arm shot forward, white fingers wrapping around a bar. No hiss of frying flesh, no stink, no smoke. She smiled again. "You see?" Maisie had quieted, still fearful but now watching their exchange with obvious interest. "Eli," she breathed, her voice thick with phlegm. "This means you could have got out any time. I didn't even need to steal the keys." "No, Maisie." Eli's head was spinning. The lights in the trailers were still glowing, and he imagined the faces of the carnies and the freaks, pressed against the glass, staring at the drama unfolding. "This woman, she's more powerful than I am. I couldn't have." "Eli, is that your name?" The woman had regained her iron grip on the fat lady's arms, and squeezed hard so that Maisie yelped like a kicked puppy. "Well, Eli, I see that you've taken quite a shine to this aberration of humanity. I'll tell you what we'll do. If you can free yourself from that cage, and frankly that is a laughably easy task for a being such as yourself, then I will let your repulsive lady friend live. However, if you cannot—" The woman bared her teeth, twin rows of needles carved from mother of pearl. Maisie met his gaze, her eyes no longer dancing but pleading. Her cheeks were red and blotchy, her nose crusted with mucus. Eli's shaking hands raised as if on threads, and he reached for the bars. The strands of dried garlic twined like deadly blossoms. The crosses were stark and white against the black metal. He flashed back to the burning, the flaying of his flesh at the touch of the tainted cage. Did he believe her? She had touched the bars with no injury, but perhaps she was older, in possession of powers that Eli could only dream of. His fingers hovered near the bars. The only sounds were Maisie's hitching breaths. The pad of his index finger made contact. For a moment he felt the heat, the promise of pain, but then it was gone. It was only metal, nothing more. His fist closed over the crosses, brushed the garlic bulbs. He felt a vibration through his bones, almost as though the bars were an extension of him, as if in conquering them he had internalized them. Drawing his strength, the power nesting within him that was fed on the gift of Maisie's blood, he parted the bars as easily as pulling aside a curtain. He could have laughed, but then a thought sobered him. I could have escaped any time. Oh, Maisie, I'm so sorry. Eli leapt to the ground. He felt like howling, like spinning madly in circles in the dust. He could run and stalk and kill again by the light of the stars. He could suck the night air into his lungs, a free man. A snuffling from Maisie brought him back to the situation at hand. The vampire woman had practically climbed onto Maisie's broad back, perching there like a sleek and beautiful vulture. "Very good, Eli," she said, her perfect hands caressing the fat lady's breasts and stomach with lascivious abandon. "I told you could do it if you wanted it enough." She smiled wide, her teeth glistening, then tipped her head in a curious gesture, like a songbird scanning the grass for worms. "It will be dawn soon," she said. "You should feed before going to ground." Eli took a step toward her. "I know I made a bargain," the woman was saying now, her hands moving lazily over Maisie's bloodied flab, through her golden curls. "But I'm so hungry, Eli. That circus master was practically all dried up, to tell you the truth. Hardly worth the eating." Her eyes glittered. She began to move. "No!" Eli jumped at her. But before he could get there, before he could stop her, the woman had reared back her head and then bent sharply forward, plunging her teeth into the yielding skin at the juncture between Maisie's neck and shoulder. The fat lady gave a high gobbling cry, and Eli rushed for her. Several scarlet rivers burst from their source at her throat, like red waters breaking a dam. Maisie's eyes watched Eli's as the life pumped out of her, and he could have cried at what he read there. He wanted to take her hands, to crush her massive body to him, to feel her heart beating in the space between them. But her eyes were already starting to dull, her knees to crumple beneath her weight. The woman tore and gulped, savage and ugly in her hunger. Before Maisie fell, before her curls stopped bobbing forever, she parted her lips, seemingly to take her last breath. But no, Eli realized as he leaned over her. The lips were forming words. "Eli," she said, her voice like a winter wind through reeds. "It's all right, honey." She was on the ground now, her body a tangle of limbs and fat, topped with bloody dribbles. The woman tearing at her shoulder no longer seemed of any concern to her. "Eli," Maisie said again, murmuring his name like a prayer. "Finish me." Her head nodded, and Eli thought she was gone, but then she raised her chin stubbornly. Her eyes were half closed and sleepy. "Drink me dry, Drac," she whispered, and then, astoundingly, she smiled. "You'll be stronger then, strong and free." She tried to lift a hand to touch his face, but she could not. Her shoulders sagged. Oh, Maisie, thought Eli. He could have loved her if circumstances had been different. She had been so giving, so generous. He didn't think he would ever meet her like again if he lived for thousands of years and searched through all the corners of the world. The thought saddened him, but only for a moment. For her selflessness, her uniqueness, well, that made her life all the more precious, did it not? With the strength and confidence bestowed on him by his wonderful and giving fat lady, he knocked the vampire woman into the dirt and knelt at Maisie's shoulder to taste just how precious she was. It is probable that everybody who is at all a constant dreamer has had at least one experience of an event or a sequence of circumstances which have come to his mind in sleep being subsequently realized in the material world. But in my opinion, so far from this being a strange thing, it would be far odder if this fulfillment did not occasionally happen, since our dreams are, as a rule, concerned with people whom we know and places with which we are familiar, such as might very naturally occur in the awake and daylit world. True, these dreams are often broken into by some absurd and fantastic incident, which puts them out of court in regard to their subsequent fulfillment. But on the mere calculation of chances, it does not appear in the least unlikely that a dream imagined by anyone who dreams constantly should occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a fulfillment of a dream, which seems to me in no way remarkable, and to have no kind of psychical significance. The manner of it was as follows. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is amiable enough to write to me about once in a fortnight. Thus, when 14 days or thereabouts have elapsed since I last heard from him, my mind probably, either consciously or subconsciously, is expectant of a letter from him. One night last week, I dreamed that as I was going upstairs to dress for dinner, I heard, as I often did, the sound of the postman's knock on my front door, and diverted my direction downstairs instead. There, among other correspondence, was a letter from him. Thereafter, the fantastic entered, for on opening it, I found inside the ace of diamonds, and scribbled across it in his well-known handwriting, "I am sending you this for safe custody. As you know, it is running an unreasonable risk to keep aces in Italy." The next evening, I was just preparing to go upstairs to dress when I heard the postman's knock, and did precisely as I had done in my dream. There, among other letters, was one from my friend. Only it did not contain the ace of diamonds. Had it done so, I should have attached more weight to the matter, which, as it stands, seems to me a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, and this suggested to me my dream. Similarly, the fact that my friend had not written to me for a fortnight suggested to him that he should do so. But occasionally it is not so easy to find such an explanation, and for the following story I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life I have been a habitual dreamer. The nights are few, that is to say, when I do not find on awaking in the morning that some mental experience has been mine, and sometimes all night long, apparently, a series of the most dazzling adventures befall me. Almost without exception, these adventures are pleasant, though often merely trivial. It is of an exception that I am going to speak. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house, where, I understood, I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-paneled hall with a large open fireplace, onto a cheerful green lawn set round with flower beds. There were grouped about the tea table a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house, and he introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year before. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. On the far side of the lawn ran a red brick wall with an iron gate in its center, outside which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shadow of the house opposite a row of long windows, inside which I could see a table with cloth laid, glimmering with glass and silver. This garden front of the house was very long, and at one end of it stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I had known that I should have got the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence, we passed through the hall, and mounted a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors set in it. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it after me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in the room, and with the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in a spasm of terror. Now that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror dwelt, and it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times, I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining room, into the windows of which I had looked on the first night when the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence, I knew, would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it in sleep. Or again, I would find myself playing cards still in silence in a drawing room lit with immense chandeliers that gave a blinding illumination. What the game was, I have no idea. What I remember, with a sense of miserable anticipation, was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." This drawing room where we played cards was next to the dining room, and, as I have said, was always brilliantly illuminated, whereas the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet how often, in spite of those bouquets of lights, have I not pored over the cards that were dealt me, scarcely able for some reason to see them? Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them there were certain cards which were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I got to know the greater part of the house. There was a smoking room, beyond the drawing room, at the end of the passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there I passed somebody whom I could not see in the doorway coming out. Curious developments, too, took place in the characters that peopled the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who, when I first saw her, had been black-haired, became gray, and instead of rising briskly, as she had done at first, when she said, "Jack will show you to your room, I've given you the room in the tower," got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up, and became a rather ill-looking young man, with a brown mustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood she was married. Then it so happened that I was not visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in such inexplicable dread did I hold it, that it had passed away for good. But one night, after this interval, I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there, while the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leaped at the thought that perhaps this time I should not have to sleep in the room in the tower. And though we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I had never yet done. But even then, matters were not altogether comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at each other. And soon the foolish stream of my talk ran dry, and gradually an apprehension worse than anything I had previously known gained on me as the light slowly faded. Suddenly a voice which I knew well broke the stillness, the voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn, and looking up I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious grayish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And as usual, Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower, I could only just see the furniture, the position of which was already familiar to me. Also, there was a dreadful odor of decay in the room, and I woke screaming. The dream, with such variations and developments as I have mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in succession. Once, as I have said, there was an intermission of 6 months. But taking a reasonable average, I should say that I dreamed it quite as often as once in a month. It had, as is plain, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which so far from getting less, seemed to me to gather fresh fear every time that I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I have mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never in the dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again, in company with a man, whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent. But owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach, in my waking hours, any significance to it. I never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then something happened. I had been in London in this year, up until the end of July, and during the first week in August went down to stay with a friend in the house he had taken for the summer months, in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, for John Clinton was to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing and go to his house in the evening. He had his motor car with him, and we set off about 5 of the afternoon, after a thoroughly delightful day, for the drive, the distance being some 10 miles. As it was so early, we did not have tea at the clubhouse, but waited till we should get home. As we drove, the weather, which up till then had been, though hot, deliciously fresh, seemed to me to alter in quality and become very stagnant and oppressive, and I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I am accustomed to before thunder. John, however, did not share my views, attributing my loss of lightness to the fact that I had lost both my matches. Events proved, however, that I was right, though I do not think that the thunderstorm that broke that night was the sole cause of my depression. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we had gone very far I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor. And with a sudden thrill, partly of fear but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of the house of my dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low oak-paneled hall and out onto the lawn, where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. It was set in flower beds, a red brick wall with a gate in it, bounded on one side, and out beyond that was a space of rough grass with a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storied tower, markedly older than the rest. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the repeated dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful persons, all of whom were known to me, and in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it now that the scene of it was thus reproduced before me, but I felt intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea pursued its cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton had got up, and at that moment I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It was not very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said, "but I think you'll be comfortable. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now? By Jove, I believe that you're right, and we are going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it's become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I went in. And at that moment, sheer unreasoning terror again possessed me. I did not know what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection, when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave with the sinister inscription, "In evil memory," I had so often seen in my dream, just beyond the lawn which lay below my window. And then, once more, the fear passed so completely that I wondered what there was to fear, and I found myself, sober and quiet and sane, in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked around it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by 2 lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing table, while ranged along the fourth wall was the washing stand and a big cupboard. My luggage had already been unpacked, for the furniture of dressing and undressing lay orderly on the washstand and toilet table, while my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were 2 rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone, the other a black and white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before in the last of the series of these repeated dreams. A rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the other portrait, which hung at the side of the bed. At that I looked next, and as I looked I felt once more the horror of the nightmare seize me. It represented Mrs. Stone as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil. Evil beamed from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in the demon-like mouth. The whole face was instinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands, clasped together on the knee, seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely and read the inscription, "Julia Stone by Julia Stone." There came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "But don't you see?" said I. "It's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Yes, I can imagine getting the nightmare if I went to sleep with that close by my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing and put it with its face to the wall. "By Jove, the old lady's a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me too. I was about to reply when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously, the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn, where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees, our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock, my host and I were the only two left. All the evening, I thought that he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone, he spoke. "The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand too, did you notice?" he said. "I asked him just now if he had cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. Now where did that blood come from?" By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I did not want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care so long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Ha, now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish Terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate which led on to the rough grass outside, where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, as if he was ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then of a sudden his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl, and scuttled back to the house with a curious crouching sort of movement. "He does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound which I could not instantly identify came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I'm afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery, for Toby and he are the best of friends. But the beginning of the cat mystery, what's the cat doing there? And why is Darius pleased while Toby is terror-stricken?" At that moment I remembered the rather horrible detail of my dreams when I saw through the gate, where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, as suddenly and heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn to the house for shelter. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. It spat and struck at John with its paw as he pushed it in order to close the door. Somehow, with the portrait of Julia Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me, and as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square empty space by my bed where the portrait had been. Here the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls it had faded. Then I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awaking was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something I knew was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away. And my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leaped out of the clouds, and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and more horrible yet perceived an odor of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I have long been waiting for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for a moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping up over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. In another second I ran out on the landing, and had banged the door behind me. Almost at the same moment I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "What is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you and heard a noise as if... Good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." I stood there, so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with a mark on my shoulder as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there. "It's in there," I said, pointing. "She, you know, the portrait is in there too, hanging up on the place we took it from." At that he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "What an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes, the portrait's there," he said. "And on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs, I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit rather than of the flesh had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some of my readers have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Folly, some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion, the coffin was found in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood.